You're studying biology, man?
Yeah.
I love biology.
I'm currently studying about how farmers use selective breeding, but I don't get it.
You know, man, if you want to know how selective breeding works, you must first examine the fundamentals of sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is the process by which an organism produces offspring with another of its species. This production of new organisms is permitted through a fusion of genetic information from the two parents of the respective sexes. Hence, sexual reproduction allows offspring to be more diverse due to gene information transfer. Sexual reproduction happens when a sperm cell comes into contact with an egg cell. The stages of sexual reproduction include pre-fertilization, fertilization, and post-fertilization. Pre-fertilization happens when the gametes are formed and transferred. Gametes are sex cells and are different in males and females. The gametes are where the chromosomes transfer genetic information. This genetic information is only half the initial amount of its parent because the cells are created through meiosis. A gamete with half the chromosomes is called a haploid, while a complete one is called a diploid. The male gamete is sperm cells, whilst the female gametes are egg cells. A gamete structure can vary for each living organism and can be stored differently. For example, plants have pollen containing the sperm cells and the ovule containing the egg cells. On the other hand, humans have a uterus containing the egg cells and testicles containing the sperm cells. Since egg cells cannot move, therefore, male gametes must be the ones to travel to the female ones to conduct fertilization. Now, fertilization happens when the male and female reproductive cells combine to form a zygote. After fertilization, post-fertilization occurs via embryogenesis, where the zygote divides mitotically, a type of cell division, and progresses into an embryo. The definition of an embryo is the initial stage of development of a multicellular organism.
Now that we have discussed sexual reproduction, let us move on to how it works in plants. Flowers have two main reproductive components, which are the carpel and stamen. The stamen is composed of the anther and filament. The anther produces a pollen grain that contains the male gametes. The carpel consists of a tip part called the stigma, a middle part called the style, and a bottom part called the ovary. The ovary contains ovules with the female gametes called the egg cell. Sexual reproduction in plants happen when a male and female gamete fuse to form a zygote. One of the processes that allows this to happen is known as pollination, otherwise known as the transfer of male gametes from the stamen of a flower to the stigma of the same or other flower. Pollination can also be separated into two types: cross-pollination and self-pollination. These types of pollination are distinguishable based on a common misconception within sexual reproduction. Conventionally, sexual reproduction happens when there are two parents. However, this can be regarded as a common misconception since this is not always the case. Plants are a frequent example of sexual reproduction with a single parent.
Cross-pollination is known to be the natural method in which transfer of pollen takes place from one flower to another, and is also known as the most common form of sexual reproduction flowers can perform. Cross-pollination usually happens thanks to the help of bugs or insects, the wind, and even the mammals like us. For example, bugs or insects are attracted to the nectar on the petals of flowers. When insects consume nectar, a little bit of pollen gets brushed on their body, and they get dropped off at other flowers. Cross-pollination results in healthier offsprings and new plant varieties. Hence, we know that it is essential for genetic variation and increasing plants' diversity and adaptability when dealing with the changing environments. Although this is not always the case. In some cases, it's actually worse to cross-pollinate because the harvest will increase too drastically. Therefore, branches might fall off, fruits may stay small, and even more. So, we have to go with a different route. And that route is self-pollination. But before we get into self-pollination, we have to recognize what hermaphrodites are. Organisms that do not require two parents are referred to as hermaphrodites. These types of organisms have both male and female sexual reproductive organs. They produce both male and female gametes. An example of an organism that can do this is plants, because they can undergo self-pollination and are not dependent on pollinators. Plants that are hermaphroditic are also called bisexual and have exceptions, such as monoecious plants.
In the event of pollen grain landing on the stigma of its flower, it is known as self-pollination. This often occurs in bisexual plants because they contain both reproductive parts, meaning they are compatible with each other in all instances. The agents of pollination that help with these types of movements are wind, insects, and water. However, some plants do not require any agents of pollination for the process to occur. The plant's stamens bend over and transfer pollen to its stigma. After a pollen grain reaches the stigma, a tube grows from the pollen and reaches the ovary. The male gamete from the pollen travels through the tube and enters the female gamete in the ovule. After the zygote is formed, it divides several times to form an embryo, a baby plant. The ovule proceeds to construct a sturdy coat and transforms into a seed. The ovary will ripen and develops a fruit around the seed. The other parts of the flowers will fall off. When a seed is planted in soil and raised in an appropriate environment, it grows into a plant. Asexual reproduction happens when an organism splits into two parts and both grow back into a single organism in which there are two organisms. This form of reproduction is different from sexual reproduction, primarily because asexual reproduction creates offspring genetically identical to its parent. In contrast, sexual reproduction requires both gametes to combine and can produce unique offspring with different genetic information. Although self-pollination can cause limited plant variety due to the genetic information coming from its own plant.
Farmers take advantage of the self-pollination method by harvesting pollen from a hermaphroditic flower and putting it inside its carpel. Farmers could also use the same method but on different flowers to do selective breeding. As mentioned before, the main disadvantage of doing this method is that the plants will not have distinct features and characteristics because the genetic material comes from the same plant.